Is it possible to say that one company is able to support an entire community? In the case of Duncan and Miller Glass Company, the answer is yes. From 1893 to 1955, Duncan and Miller was the backbone of Washington and the surrounding area. Every family in Washington had at least one person who worked for Duncan and Miller in the early 1900s. George Duncan was born in Fayette County in 1812. In 1836, he moved to Pittsburgh and was a hammerman in the Sligo Iron Works. In 1865, Duncan became a partner in the D.C. Ripley & Company Tremont Glass. Upon the death of D.C. Ripley in 1874, George became the sole owner of the company. In April of that year, George Duncan and his wife Agnes formed the company as George Duncan & Sons. John Ernest Miller was born in 1840 in Germany, and his family settled in America in 1845. He worked in glass factories in Pittsburgh and Steubenville from the age of 10. He enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War from 1861 to 1864. Following his war service, he worked for the Steubenville Flint Glass Works, independent mold maker Washington Beck, and King's Son & Company. He joined George Duncan & Sons in 1874 as a mold shop superintendent and designer. Miller's most famous design is the three-face, inspired by the profile of his wife, Elizabeth. James Duncan Sr., who became head of the firm in 1877 when George Duncan died, his brother Harry, and John Ernest Miller decided to open a new factory on Jefferson Avenue in Washington. On January 3, 1893, the new Washington plant opened. The 16-pot deep eye furnaces were fired up and glass produced on February 9th. The period from 1893 to the closing of the plant in 1955 is generally known as the Duncan Miller period, although the company was initially known as George Duncan Sons & Company until November 15, 1900, when the firm was incorporated as Duncan and Miller Glass Company. Some of Duncan and Miller's most popular styles were produced during the 1920s through the 1940s, including the Canterbury, Caribbean, Hobnail, Nautical, Sandwich, Spiral Flutes, and Teardrop. The most famous design was a swan which required 14 craftsmen to complete. All the work came to an abrupt end on June 13, 1955. Mechanization and foreign imports made the production of fine handmade glass uneconomical, and so the decision was made to close the plant. James Duncan III sold the business to Tiffin Glass, but in the sale he ensured the legacy of Duncan and Miller. Part of the sale agreement was that Tiffin Glass would create a Duncan and Miller division, which would continue into the 1980s. Another part of the agreement was that any current employee of Duncan and Miller would receive a job at Tiffin Glass. The legacy of Duncan and Miller's continued today through the efforts of the National Duncan Glass Society and their operation of the Duncan and Miller Glass Museum. In 1975, Orva Heisenbuttel and Betty Duncan Fries established the National Duncan Glass Society, and in 1993, the Duncan Miller Museum opened its doors. The history of the Duncan and Miller Glass Company, except for its remarkable duration, is typical of the glass industry in western Pennsylvania. It is not unusual to trace an individual's journey from child laborer to principal owner of a company. But what makes Duncan and Miller so unique is the connection it has to a small town in southwestern Pennsylvania. In the early 19th century, it was the Duncan and Miller Company that helped support an entire community. And now it's that community that works to maintain the history and heritage of the company that did so much to make Washington what it is today.